The studio was alive with energy. The cameras rolled, the applause sign blinked furiously, and Jimmy Kimmel strutted out with his trademark charm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "tonight, we've got a legend in the building. A man who doesn't sleep, he waits. A man who counted to infinity a broken bar twice. Please welcome, the one and only, Chuck Norris." The crowd erupted. Some clapped with nostalgic admiration. Others chanted his name like a rally cry. Chuck emerged from behind the curtain, his posture calm, his gaze unreadable. Dressed in simple jeans and a button-down shirt, he didn't need flash. His presence carried its own gravity. Jimmy stood to greet him, grinning. "Wow, Chuck, you look like you just bench pressed a grizzly bear before coming here." Chuck chuckled softly, shaking his hand. "Only one grizzly today. I'm taking it easy." They sat down to thunderous applause, and for the first few minutes, the conversation played like classic late-night TV. Jimmy flipped through Chuck's long filmography, tossing out questions about Walker, Texas Ranger, the Delta Force movies, and even that time Chuck did a commercial with Bruce Lee's ghost using CGI. But then, as the segment progressed, Jimmy began to lean into his more provocative style, the brand of comedy that dances on the edge of mockery and commentary. He smirked and said, "You know, Chuck, back in the day you took out armies with one punch. Now it feels like you could just run for president and win with the roundhouse kick to the polls." Chuck grinned slightly. "I think politics could use a little more discipline and a little less drama." Jimmy raised an eyebrow. "Speaking of drama, what do you make of all these people whining about free speech being under attack? You think they're just soft?" The studio tensed slightly, sensing the shift. Chuck leaned forward, thoughtful. "I think a lot of people are frustrated, Jimmy. They feel like they're being talked over, laughed at. Doesn't matter what side they're on. Dismissing that as weakness, that's part of the problem." Jimmy tried to pivot. "Fair enough, fair enough. But I mean, a broken bar, come on. Some of the stuff these folks say online, maybe they deserve a good old Chuck Norris heel to the face." "Huh?" The audience chuckled. Chuck didn't. His gaze sharpened. "Violence isn't a joke to me," he said. "I've trained for years to control it, not glorify it. And mocking people because they disagree with you, that's not humor. That's just arrogance." The laughter died. Jimmy, momentarily caught off guard, blinked. "Well, okay, I was just riffing, Chuck, you know, being funny, like we do." Chuck sat back, his tone cool. "There's a difference between funny and cheap. You know it." Jimmy exhaled, forcing a laugh. "Man, I gotta be careful around you. One wrong word and it's lights out." That's when the crowd sensed the tone had truly shifted. Chuck didn't break into his usual grin. Instead, he offered a calm but firm retort. "Words have power, Jimmy, especially when you've got a mic in front of you and millions watching. You can use that power to punch down or lift people up." Jimmy's smile flickered. "I think you're reading a little too much into this. I've had all kinds of people on this show, Democrats, Republicans, even conspiracy theorists." Chuck tilted his head. "And how many of them did you actually listen to?" Now the studio was dead silent. No chuckles, no clapping, just the hum of the cameras and the sound of Jimmy shifting in his chair. You could feel the unease in the air like static before lightning. To ease the tension, Jimmy tried again with humor. "You know what I think this means? We need a good old-fashioned Norris Kimmel sparring match. Settle this with a couple of jabs and maybe a roundhouse or two." Chuck's eyes didn't move. "Jimmy, if I hit you, you wouldn't wake up till the next season." The audience didn't know whether to laugh or gasp. It was a line delivered so deadpan, so flatly intimidating, that even Jimmy had to pause. He tried to chuckle, brushing off the tension like dust, but it clung. That's when the camera cut to commercial a little earlier than scheduled. Behind the scenes, producers scrambled, unsure of how to handle the growing heat between one of the most iconic martial artists in American pop culture and their host. It wasn't a bit anymore, it was real, and the tension hadn't even peaked yet. The commercial break ended with the usual upbeat music, but the mood in the studio had unmistakably shifted. Jimmy returned to his mark, the smile on his face a bit more forced than before. Chuck Norris sat quietly, hands folded in his lap, his expression unreadable, composed, but clearly not amused. "Trying to steer the ship back to safer waters," Jimmy said with exaggerated cheer. "Well, folks, If you're just tuning in, Chuck Norris just gave me a verbal roundhouse kick, and I'm still standing. Barely. A few audience members chuckled nervously. Chuck didn't crack a smile. Jimmy glanced at the cue cards and tried to pivot again. So, Chuck, tell me about your latest project. I heard you're doing some charity work for veterans. That's amazing stuff. Chuck nodded slowly. Yes, it's called Kickstart Kids. We teach character through martial arts, discipline, respect, responsibility, something a lot of people in power seem to have forgotten. The audience responded with polite applause, but the undertone in Chuck's voice was unmistakably pointed. Jimmy, sensing the barb, raised an eyebrow. Including late-night hosts? He asked, half joking. Chuck shrugged. If the shoe fits. For a moment, the tension grew unbearable. Jimmy leaned back in his chair, exhaled through his nose, and then, perhaps forgetting who he was sitting across from, said something he'd come to regret. Well, Chuck, at least I still have a sense of humor. Not everyone has to act like they're on a crusade every time a joke lands the wrong way. Chuck's eyes narrowed slightly. It's not about taking offense, Jimmy. It's about responsibility. There's a difference between comedy and ridicule. You've made a career poking fun at people who can't fire back. Jimmy smirked again. Perhaps as a defense mechanism. But you can fire back, right? I mean, you've got half the internet believing you invented oxygen. You're not exactly powerless. Chuck leaned forward, his voice low and controlled. Don't confuse popularity with immunity. Being respected doesn't mean I let things slide, especially when the tone changes from funny to condescending. The room was on edge. Producers backstage were frozen. One of them whispered into a headset, "Do we pull him now, or let it burn out?" Jimmy, clearly rattled, tried to wave it all off. All right, he said, holding his hands up. Let's all just relax. This isn't court, it's a talk show. No need to turn this into a morality seminar. Chuck nodded slowly. Then maybe you shouldn't use it like a courtroom, a passing judgment from a desk while the people you mock don't get to respond. Jimmy laughed nervously, trying to downplay everything. Geez, Chuck, you sound like you've got a vendetta against comedians. Chuck stood up calmly, removing his lapel mic. Just the ones who mistake their stage for a pulpit. The audience gasped. Jimmy instinctively stood as well, trying to salvage the moment. Chuck, come on, sit down. We're just talking here. You're taking this way too seriously. Chuck turned to face him, and though his voice remained calm, it was sharper than ever. You know what's serious, Jimmy? The way millions of people tune in to shows like this to be told who to laugh at. That's influence. That's power. And when you use it to belittle people instead of enlighten them, you're not just joking. You're shaping the world. The room was dead silent. No one moved. A couple of crew members exchanged glances, unsure if this was still part of the show or the collapse of it. Jimmy, clearly irritated now, muttered into his mic, "Guess Chuck can't take a joke anymore." Chuck froze for just a moment at the edge of the stage. The audience waited, breathless. Then he turned slowly, fixing Jimmy with a gaze that could split stone. "I've taken bullets, Jimmy. I've fought in war. I buried friends, and I've stood up to real enemies. You're just a guy behind a desk with cue cards. You think cracking wise at someone's expense is bravery? Try doing something that matters without a punchline." And with that, Chuck turned and walked off stage. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by a few scattered claps from audience members who didn't know what else to do. Backstage, producers huddled in chaos. "He's done," one of them said. "We can't have him back after that." Kimmel looked like he got slapped with truth on live TV. Word quickly spread across social media as clips surfaced within minutes. The hashtags #ChuckUnfiltered and #KimmelConfronted exploded. As Chuck walked out of the building, a reporter managed to catch him outside. "Mr. Norris, were you kicked off the show?" Chuck paused, looked directly into the camera, and said, "I wasn't kicked off. I walked away." There's a difference. And with that, he disappeared into the night, cool, calm, and completely unbothered, having just delivered a roundhouse kick without even lifting his leg.